All right, in this video, we are going to learn some of the basics of ink wash. In this container, I have just straight India ink, and in this one, I have water. And I'm gonna use just a regular palette to paint from. Ink wash is similar to watercolor in that you can layer and build your layers as they dry. You can also work wet into wet and use dry brush painting. But it's a little bit less forgiving than watercolor. You can't really wet it and then pull back up some of the values like you can with watercolor. So you have to be a little bit more careful, and sometimes you have to plan things out a little bit better. So I'm just gonna get some ink in the palette to start things off. I'm gonna start by putting just water in the palette. These droppers just help me control how much I'm using. So in one of them, I'm going to use a lot of water, and then I'll use less water in some of the other ones. So I'm just going to put 1 drop of ink in this one, and a couple in here, and a little bit more in here. And then this one over here, I'm just gonna put straight ink. This will not wash out of your clothes. It is permanent, so be careful. So there's several different techniques that I'm gonna show you. You can work wet into wet, just like you do with watercolor. To do this, you can paint an area just with water if you want to. And then you can add your ink to it. And if you want to make a gradation, so it gradually gets darker, you can gradually use the ink to build that up. You have to be careful not to go over the same area too much, or your paper will start peeling and you'll get these little crumbs on it, and it kind of messes everything up. So you have to be careful with that. If you paint with straight ink, it looks like this. You can use smaller brushes. You can change the way you hold the brush to make different kind of marks. You can add water to parts that you've already painted, but see how like that line has dried already? So that's what I mean by it's less forgiving than watercolor. You can use dry brush also, like you do with watercolor. So like, let's say I get some ink on my brush, but I wipe some of it off on another location. Now I can use this, and those can make different kinds of textures. If you're trying to paint something, like let's say I'm working on a portrait where I want to build up layers and get some darker shadows over time, you might let something like this dry and then come back later with a darker value on top of it. So you can build your layers up a little bit at a time. Another thing that we have is something called Frisket. It's kind of like rubber cement. You can use this, and this can block your paper so that the ink will not cover the paper wherever you have this. So let's say I put like a bunch of little dots here, and then I let this glue dry. I can paint over this area, let the ink dry, and then I can rub these off and it will be white underneath. I'm gonna give that time to dry, and I'll come back and do that in just a minute. At this point, the dots that I made with the Frisket are dry, so I am going to paint straight ink right on top of them. And when that ink dries, I'm going to be able to just rub the Frisket off and you'll see the white paper underneath. This is true of anything that you're using. Like maybe you want the background to be pink. So maybe you could paint pink watercolor in the background first, let that dry, then put your Frisket down, let that dry, then put your ink down, and then when you rub the Frisket away, it'll be the pink color that's underneath. So whatever's underneath, that's what's going to show up. So now my ink is dry, I'm going to rub off the Frisket. You basically just go like this and it will rub right off. And there's the white underneath.